Hello and welcome back to Russ's Movie Corner. My name is Russ, and as you can see, I am sitting in front of my movie corner. My Through Faith t-shirt on, my Paul, Apostle of Christ movie right next to me, and judging by the frame around me, we are back taking down SciManDan's video, Creationist has Proof of Noah's Flood. And in the last video, when we were talking about this, SciManDan ended up kind of saying that, when he said something like, well, back when all those animals died, the earth looked very different than it does today. The mountains weren't mountains and the deserts weren't deserts. And I was like, exactly what Ken Hovind and Matt Powell have been saying for years, Dan. You literally just confirmed exactly what they were saying before. Okay, in fact, I think it's in number 6, Creation Seminar number 6, that Kent Hovind actually says, because he was talking about the latent heat of condensation, like if it rained enough to cover Mount Everest, it would heat up the world to boiling temperatures. And he goes, so do you so like this guy asks Ken Hovind, do you think that it rained enough to cover Mount Everest? And he goes, no, I don't think Mount Everest was there. Because lest we forget, rock doesn't bend. This is one thing that many people forget to really think about when they start to look at rock layers, especially folds and faults. Folds don't happen normally, okay? Because folds have to happen while the rock is still fairly soft. Otherwise, you would have a lot more breaks and shears in the rock. And because when I observed down in Bishop, California on my Geology 210 trip, what we observed down there were not many like rock breaks. Everything was perfectly folded. Okay? And so you can only have that when the crust is still soft, because if it's not soft, it'll break. Okay? Like, take a rock hammer and go out and smash a rock. It's not going to bend. It's going to shatter. Okay? That's what happens when you have a fault line. Okay? When you have two plates that are moving against each other like this, the rock actually shears. Okay? It actually breaks when it moves. Okay? So, you can't have that unless it's pliable still. Hence why Matt Powell is saying, how did these whales and, things get to the top of mountains? Okay? There's no evidence that whales lived 130 million years ago. Okay? We have whale fossils in layers of dirt because likely they were doing something at the time. They might have been down, they might have been nearer to like coastlines when the floodwaters came over and the mud encased them, okay? And they likely got, carried along with the mud to a certain point, okay? But as stated in the previous one, why is it that most of the dinosaur fossils and most of those things right along what we call the Continental Divide, basically the Rocky Mountains in the USA, why are most of those fossil beds found right along those mountains? How did they get there? And you can't tell me that 130 million years ago, because not every single one of those dinosaur fossils is 130 million years old. Because Dan even said in the previous episode that like some were 65, 70 million years old, some were, older than that by, 100, and then some are 130, some are 270. You can't say that, A, because you don't know, and B, how can you say that, like, say, the Tyrannosaur was 70 million and a Stegosaurus was 130 million, then how can you say that, oh, 130 million years ago this happened, but then this happened at, but then it's like the Tyrannosaur died the same way. That would be multiple floods, and you can't say that there was multiple floods because you don't have enough evidence to say that there was multiple floods. But the evidence does suggest that those layers were created by one global flood, Noah's flood, that covered the mountains of the time up to 15 cubits. And that's, elbow to fingertip. Okay? Plus these 4 fingers if you're using the Royal Egyptian cubit. So either 18 or 22 inches. Okay? And so that gives us a what? About a couple foot discrepancy. Within 5 feet. But still, that's a heck of a lot. And there is evidence to suggest, through the eruption of Mount St. Helens, through, some of the processes that we've observed over the years, that rapid geology is a thing. In fact, it's likely that a lot of geologists, even when I was taking geology back in the day, they said that the Himalayan mountains likely were not formed over millions of years. It was likely a very rapid process because the speed needed to create the height of the mountains. The Indian plate had to have been moving very, very quickly when it crashed into the Asian plate. Okay? And the rock layers had to be the exact same density so that when they hit, they went like that. Okay? So even geologists know that uniformitarianism does not always explain what we see on the planet. Okay? So let's jump back in and see what Matt Powell has to say, and then we'll see what SciManDan has to say.
This is why we find clams that are in the closed position that were catastrophically buried on top of Mount Everest.
Yep.
29,000 feet above sea level. We also find trees going through all of the different layers of supposed geologic time. Mm-hmm. People think that these layers are millions of years of different time zones. If you have a tree that was placed there at the time of the formation of the layers around it, that means that the layers are not millions of years of different ages.
Okay, first off, a fossilized tree is not an organic tree.
You're correct, Dan, but just because that a fossilized tree is not an organic tree doesn't mean that the petrified tree stood there for millions of years while the layers formed around it. Because it would have had to have been buried by several layers to keep it in that position while it petrified, if petrification took millions of years, and then it would have had to have gone around it. Because those are not fossilized trees, those are petrified trees. Okay? Now, in certain circumstances, Kent Hovind has some slides where he shows trees that are petrified, coalified, running through a coal seam, and then petrified, running through the layers. So, yes, sometimes the tree was caught in such a way that there was organic matter that turned into coal. And the tree trunk itself was turned into coal. But above and below, where there's rock layers, it's petrified. Okay? And I don't know about you, but there's only one forest on Earth today that has petrified trees in it. Okay? And that's the petrified forest in California, USA. Okay? I've been by there. We stopped off and saw some of the petrified trees. Okay? And I don't remember now exactly how it happened. I think they talked about it a little bit in geology, but it's been so long since I've done geology that I don't remember the exact reason they had in the book for it. Okay? But I do know that it doesn't take millions of years to petrify something. Okay? Things can petrify fairly quickly. Okay? And here again, beating a dead horse, Kent Hovind has a ton of examples of things being petrified very quickly. So we know it doesn't take millions of years. Okay? Just like we know it doesn't take millions of years to create coal, just like we know it doesn't take millions of years to create diamonds, okay, because they create them in the lab, and they just take chunks of carbon and they press them down with heat and pressure, and they make diamonds out of them, lab-grown diamonds. You can look that up. And they'll literally say, oh, it took us in the lab like, a few days, but it takes nature millions of years. No, it doesn't take nature millions of years. You're assuming it takes nature millions of years, because when you dig down 2,000 feet to get to the diamonds, there's a lot of heat and pressure down there. And so any coal that forms gets turned into diamonds because of the heat and pressure at that depth. It's why we haven't run out of diamonds, folks. You'd have thought that if those diamonds were millions of years old, that we would have dug them all out of the earth by now. Because we've been digging them since like the 1700s. Literally. Okay? They've been digging diamonds out of Africa now for over 400 years. And there's no shortage of diamonds in the world. None. They keep finding them. Okay? So, yeah. That's not a problem. It explains everything. Okay?
And those layers are formed very rapidly, most likely from volcanic eruptions.
Not necessarily. Okay? Because it depends on A, the size of the eruption. And it also depends on B, how many volcanoes are erupting at once. So you would either have to have a ton of volcanic debris spread out over a huge area, like basically supermassive volcanoes the size of either Crater Lake in Oregon, USA, or Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming, USA, all over the world. And we haven't seen that. We've only ever documented like 2 or 3 of those around the world. And we know from studying some patterns of ash that in certain layers that we know how big their spread patterns are. And so, no. Petrification of trees in layers like you see are not explained by that, because we know from Mount St. Helens that not all of the trees petrified. Some of them stayed organic trees. Like, they were blown down, they were stripped of all their limbs and all their bark, but when they drilled inside, they took a core sample, they found that the center of the tree was still organic. The whole thing hadn't petrified. And even today, some of those trees, okay, on the bottom side, rotted away. The top side may have petrified, but the bottom side stayed organic and it rotted away. And it was eaten by bugs and bacteria and everything else. So no, Dan, that doesn't explain all of those trees in those layers that your side says is millions of years old. Okay? Because it would have had to have frozen the trees perfectly in layers. Or they would have had to have been like in Spirit Lake, where they would have, like, the root ball would have, like, waterlogged and then pulled it down and put it on the bottom of the lake, which there are a lot of trees out of Spirit Lake that do that now, because there's like an underwater forest in Spirit Lake. It's where all the floating log mat went. most of those logs are down on the bottom, sticking root ball up. Or root ball sitting in the bottom, and then the tree sticking straight up out of the bottom of the lake. And there are layers of dirt that are depositing around it. Okay? So, years from now, they have another explosion, more dirt will go over it, okay? And then more dirt will go over it, and eventually they will probably petrify at the bottom of the lake. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if most of them aren't petrified already, okay? Just because they're sitting in very mineral-rich water because of the eruption in May of 1980, okay? So, no, Dan, your explanation doesn't explain why we see logs or trees that are completely petrified sitting in layers that your side says is X millions of years old. It does not make any sense. The flood explains it. Your explanation does not, okay? And that's the point that both Matt Powell and I are trying to bring up to you and your side, is that not everything you say makes a whole lot of sense. This is what we do. We're poking holes in your side's story, okay, to say, look, not all of this matches up with what you're saying. Because some of us have observed, actually in the field, like I've been to Mount St. Helens a number of times, I've been on geology trips, I've gone down and seen things. There are certain things that don't match up to what your side says, Dan. And so because of that, we're just saying there are some things that don't add up, and it's up to you to explain it. Okay? But you're not explaining it, you're just offering something and then moving on.
We also find coal deposits that are over 100 feet thick.
Yeah.
Now, coal comes from vegetation and different organisms that have been smashed together between sediments.
Mm-hmm.
How in the world are you going to get a coal deposit that's over 100 feet thick?
It's really not hard to see that swampland would cause really thick coal deposits.
Not necessarily, Dan. Because how much time would you need for that swampland to produce that coal? Now, here's another big thing, and this is one thing I keep telling people. Why is it that in one of the places with the largest desert, okay, the Arabian Peninsula has one of the largest deserts on Earth, uninterrupted desert, okay? You've got Oman, you've got UAE, you've got Yemen, you've got, Saudi Arabia, you've got Kuwait, you've got Iraq. How in the hell does that place have all that oil? I know. They don't. Go read Genesis chapter 1. Okay? Because in it places exactly where the Garden of Eden was. Okay? In fact, I think it's actually Genesis chapter 2. Where it basically says, a river flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and there it divided and became 4 rivers. This is 2:10, okay, in Genesis. 2:11. The name of the first is the Pishon. It is the one that flowed around the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. And the gold of that land is good. Bdellium and onyx stone are there. The name of the second river is the Gihon. It is the one that flowed around the whole land of Cush. And the name of the third river is the Tigris, which flows east of Assyria, and the fourth river is the Euphrates. It places pretty much where the Garden of Eden would be. and where there would have been a lot of vegetation around it, because after God kicked them out of Eden, okay, it said on the east side of the garden there was a cherubim, okay. If we look at the end of chapter 3, he said he drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden he placed the cherubim and a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. And it doesn't say that there was a barren nothing out there. It says that there was plants and lush grass and all this kind of stuff. So it would have been conceivable that when the Lord made the earth, he made plants. He made plant life. Okay? When he destroyed the earth in the flood, he basically made all of that stuff, and he said, okay, so he destroyed most of those plants, and the plants that came back afterwards, after the earth was destroyed, there would have been more things. So if you look above my head and you look at this peninsula right here, this is what I'm talking about, okay? All in this area where it's mostly desert, okay, there are huge, huge oil and coal deposits. Huge oil and coal deposits. Okay? And as far as we know, there was never any swampland in that area. And from looking around, the interesting thing is that when people have done geological surveys in the area, they can't find any evidence of vast swamplands. Okay? Now, let me ask you a question. Why is it that, like, the south of the United States, southeast, is rich in oil deposits? Ever ask yourself that question? Why is it that, like, from Houston all the way to Florida, there's huge amounts of oil rigs and oil wells and oil refineries? And they're out in California too. There's a huge, huge deposit across the Midwest of coal and natural gas. In fact, when I was leaving Perry Tech, that was one of the companies that was hiring, was a company that had just discovered that huge pocket of natural gas. Okay? Why is it? Where would that have come from? It has to take a lot of biomass to create that. So ask yourself this question, where did it come from? Now, a lot of people are going to say, well, the earth was different millions of years ago. That doesn't explain it. The flood explains it, because it would have buried that organic matter very, very quickly. And over the last, 4,400 years, 4,500 years, now here it is. That's what I'm saying. This was never a swamp, but there is huge, huge oil deposits in the Middle East. And why is it that this desert behind Dan's head here is only 4,400, 4,300 years old? You ever ask yourself that question? Why is the largest desert in the world only 4,300 years old? Why isn't it larger? I know why. 4,400 years ago, there was a flood. Noah's flood.
Is this really an argument, Matt?
Well, it's much more of an argument than you've made, Dan. I mean, just in the last, 10, 15 minutes, I've made more of an argument than you did in, 2 minutes? Not even a minute? Come on, man. And you call yourself SciManDan. This is the reason why I don't call him, I call him SciManDan at the beginning of my videos, but this is the reason why I call him ScamManDan. Because he doesn't know that much about science. He really doesn't. He'd like to think he does. Okay? He offers some fairly convincing platitudes, but he doesn't really offer much in the way of a defense of science. He just kind of states things like they're a fact and then moves on. Okay? When nothing could be further from the truth. And the thing is that here's a question you have to ask yourself, Dan. Was that a swamp that had all that coal in it? Because what if it wasn't a swamp? What if they just discovered that coal bed and there wasn't a swamp there before? There was no evidence of a swamp being there. The reason why they use the swamp is because swamps tend to deposit a lot of biomass in terms of like leaves fall from trees and limbs fall during storms, and like when trees die they fall over, and so there's a lot of biomass at the bottom of the lake, at the bottom of the swamp, and it tends to get compacted over time. We know that. But that doesn't always explain exactly what's going on, because there may not have been a swamp there, Dan. Did that ever cross your mind? I don't think it did. You're just going to assume that it's a swamp because Matt put up a picture of a swamp, and you're going, oh, see, swamps do cause a lot of biomass, and it causes a lot of coal. Yeah, but that doesn't always explain it, because there may not have been a swamp there. The flood explains it, because the flood would have buried a lot of biomass very quickly, and some of it would have coalified, and some of it would have liquefied. The liquefaction of said biomass is oil, while the coalification of it becomes the coal that we dig out and put in and burn. It's the same thing either way. It doesn't matter whether we're burning it in our cars or we're burning it in a power plant to make steam. It's the same damn fuel. I mean, seriously, dude. If I have to explain that to you, you're not SciManDan. You're ScamManDan.
This shows us that the pre-flood world was extremely lush. There was a lot of vegetation.
Yeah.
There was large animals, dinosaurs, that were all buried together with trees and with different organic materials and creating massive, massive amounts of coal. Now, mountains themselves are great proof of Noah's flood. If you look at the layers of some of these mountains, you'll notice that all of the layers are bent. You cannot bend hard rock.
Yep.
That means that all of these layers were moist when they were laid down, and then when the plates were moving, they were bent upwards as all of them were pliable and all of them solidified together in one event.
Okay, so before we let Dan talk here, I'm just going to say this. Whenever you're at the dinner table again, grab a couple of placemats if you have them. Okay, a couple of cloth placemats. Okay, place one hand kind of near to the edge of one of them, and place your other hand kind of at the back edge of the other placemat, and then run them together. And you're going to look, take a picture of it, okay? Have somebody take a picture of it, and then look at the west coast of the United States, specifically California. And the reason for that being that you have a little mountain range right where the two plates hit, okay, along the San Andreas Fault from San Fran all the way down, okay, to the Mexican border. You have a little bit of a mountain range on one side, okay, on the Pacific plate side. On the North American plate side, you get a dip, okay, so San Fernando Valley, and then you'll have a big mountain, okay, that's the Sierra Nevadas. Then you have a dip, that's the Owens Valley, where Bishop, California is. Then you'll have a big mountain range, that's the beginning of the Basin Range, that's where White Mountain is in Nevada. And then you'll have a bunch of ripples behind it. And that's the basin and range. That's the end of the basin and range system going back. And if you look at Google Earth, okay, and follow from Los Angeles, okay, go out west, across the San Fernando Valley, okay, and then look at the Sierra Nevadas, look at the Owens Valley, and then look at the basin and range. And that's exactly what happened. Okay, when the two met, okay, it bunched up on the North American side, and a little bit on the Pacific side. And that little bit on the Pacific side is the little bit of the San Fernando Valley that's on that side of the Sierra Nevadas. That's why I said the San Fernando Valley, is because the San Andreas Fault kind of cuts that in two. Okay, the San Fernando Valley, and then you'll see the Santa Ana Mountains where the Hollywood sign is. Okay, all those mountains right in there. And then you'll see the basin that Los Angeles sits in. Okay? And it's the same thing. You look up north at San Francisco. San Francisco does the same thing. Okay? That's the beginning of the San Andreas Fault, where the two plates connected. Okay? So, that's part of it. Okay? And that's what I'm saying. If you look at it, the only way that happens is because, what am I using? I'm using soft material as placemats. You know, I'm using placemats that are made of cloth. Okay, I'm not using paper. I'm not using rock. Yeah, try that. Okay, take a couple of rocks, literally, okay, and then smash them together. And see if they bend. They won't. And it doesn't matter if you took those rocks, okay, and like threw them together at 100 miles an hour, 200 miles an hour, 500 miles an hour, they'll never bend. They will explode, but they will never bend. Okay? Not in the way that we see in those pictures that Matt Powell just showed us. The only way that happens is when things are soft. That's the only way. You can't have it. You can't have it both ways. You can't say, "Oh, rocks bend," when they don't, and then say, "Well, they weren't that soft. I mean, you know, they could have been magma when they bent." No, that doesn't always explain it either. Okay. That doesn't always explain it. So, sorry, it just doesn't. You have to explain it within the science. So now let's see what Dan says.
Geological folds around the world are all different ages. Radiometrically tested.
No, they're not. No, they're not. Not always. Now, they may have radiologically tested some of them, but that assumes that, A, if they'd used potassium argon, that assumes that the amount of radioactive potassium in the thing was what it was originally, and that there was no argon, which we have in the atmosphere. So that assumes that there's no argon in there when it started. Okay? Which, any amount of argon in the crust would automatically throw your readings off exponentially. It happens all the time with C14 dating. Okay? Parent-daughter isotope readings only work when they're based on the assumption that there is only parent in the original material and there was no daughter isotopes in the original material, and that the parent isotopes have had enough time to decay into the daughter isotopes. That's the only reason it works. And if any of those are out of phase at all, it throws off the whole reading. In fact, a guy threw a bunch of crap into my thing on another SciManDan that I was doing, and he threw a whole bunch of stuff in, and he was like, and he had this graph on there and all this kind of stuff, and I said, dude, your graph literally tells people exactly what they need to know. Because you take the readings that are closest to what you think the dates are, and you throw the rest out. Now what they do is they put a line through the graph, and then they say, okay, well, we see that we have a cluster of isotopes right at this part, see, and so this is the age that we're supposed to be at, so that's the one, and then we say, oh, okay, well, it might be plus or minus, so many odd, millions of years or billions of years or whatever. But that's a huge error ratio. When you're saying it could be, let's say 500 million years, give or take 400 million years. Now you're talking about something from 100 million years to 900 million years. That is an 800 million year gap that you can't account for. And that's a huge error ratio. Okay? Now, if you said it's 500 million years plus or minus 500,000 years, now that's a little bit more accurate. Because now you're within about 1 million years of 500 million years. So you're within 495,000 or 499,500,000 years to 500,000 and 500 million years. So, 500,500,000 years. But the point being that when you have an error ratio that big of a gap of billions of years or millions of years, you're talking about a huge span of time that you can't account for at all, ever. And again, that's assuming that A, your calculations work in terms of potassium, a radioactive potassium molecule decaying into argon over said number of millions of years, because we've never had that much time to observe it, we just hope it happens, and that there was only parent isotope and no daughter isotope in the original layer. So that if you had a layer, okay, that was 130 million years old, and you want to say, we picked up some samples, we took them back to our lab, and we did potassium-argon dating on it. And so we know that it's, and we got this, thing, so it's 130 plus or minus, 30 million years. Okay? So that means it could be 100 million years to 160 million years. So now you have a span of 60 million years that you can't account for. Okay? Again, huge error ratio. But that means that your sample had some kind of daughter isotope in it when it started, but the assumption is that there was only parent and no daughter isotope when you went to go do that. Because they do it with C14 dating, they do it with everything. Okay? That's how radiological dating works. So for Dan to sit there and go, yay, we've used this method, and this method is the only method, is crap. It's absolute crap. Because you can't say with absolute certainty that that's what that layer is. Because A, you're assuming it's millions of years old. B, you're using circular reasoning because you say, okay, index fossil says it's this many millions of years old. We know it's this many millions of years old because it has these fossils in it. And C, you're assuming that there was no daughter isotope in there to begin with when we know that there is argon in the atmosphere itself. And we know that it's naturally occurring argon. Okay? So that means that it can get trapped in those layers. So it can throw off your calculations because now you're not accounting for that error. The only way that they try to account for maybe some daughter isotopes getting stuck in there is they use that error factor, but they're throwing out so much data because if they didn't, they would have, it is 130 million plus or minus 130 million. Which means it could be as old as the Earth is now to 260 million years old. That's 100% error ratio, by the way. Which is why they throw out most of the data except for one central part of the grid. And when I answered the guy back, I said, thank you for admitting the obvious. Because he literally said that in his quote. And then he came back later and said, I didn't say that. So I highlighted the paragraph and I put it in there and I said, this is from you, not from me. This is from you. You said this. Sorry. It's not me saying it. It's you.
You just can't argue with that.
According to
yes you can, Dan. I just did. Sorry. Sorry that your vaunted science exclamation point trademarked doesn't work, son.
humanists, the plates on the Earth have only been moving about 1 to 2 inches per year.
Now.
These plates slowly create the mountains as one slides under the other plate. This could not have happened. These mountain ranges that we see would have shattered and broken. They would have eroded flat. You cannot bend hard rock. All of these rocks that we see on these mountains were all soft and moist at the time of their formation.
Yeah.
Ah, great, Matt. Let's see your master's and degree in geology.
Let's see yours, Dan. Okay, because here's the thing. Okay. What did I do with that? Son of a biscuit. Oh, there it is. All right, come here. Come here. Okay. Okay, see, here's the thing. Okay. When I went to Bishop, California, okay, I saw this formation, okay, called the tongue. And I know it's going to be kind of hard to see, okay, but that's the tongue. Okay, that's the tongue right there. And it literally is a bunch of folds. There's a bunch of layers over on this side, and they all roll up and down these mountains back over here, okay? Now, I don't have a master's degree in geology. I don't need a master's degree in geology to tell me that those layers didn't form slowly over millions of years, even though when I learned about this crap, they said it was millions of years old. Because that was one of the questions I asked my teacher at the time. Okay? I said, hey, how did that thing form like that? Because, I mean, there's no breaks in it. And it's solid rock. I mean, you could hit it with a hammer and it was solid. And he goes, yeah. It's how we look at it. Just go with it. Got me thinking. If he doesn't know, and this guy's a volcanologist, okay, he studies earthquakes, volcanoes for a living, okay, he's been featured on Discovery Channel and like other programs, okay, he's like one of the most sought after guys out there when it comes to earthquakes and volcanoes, okay, the man is amazing. But if he's going to tell me that that thing formed slowly over millions of years, I have a couple of questions. Namely, how? With no breaks. Because again, Dan, take some rocks and bash them together. Hell, get some things, get a couple of rocks, put them in a vise. Put them in a vise. Okay? And squeeze them together and see if they bend. And yeah, you can do it slowly. You know, maybe one turn every few months. See if you can get them to bend. I guarantee you they won't. They're going to shatter. Okay? Because that's what rocks do. But hey, you can't question the science! Exclamation point. Trademarked. Right?
And your paper that you wrote to explain how mountains are not caused by tectonic activity. We'll wait.
And that's...
You know, Dan, even if he did write a paper on that, you'd probably dismiss it. Because that's what your side does. I mean, case in point, okay? Because there are papers out there. There are geologists who have studied these things, who have done things, okay? And your side says, oh no, no, you can't do that, you can't have that. I mean, this one guy put up a database, he's a Christian, okay? And he put up a database of all the flood research that is going on all over the world. And his aim was to show that all of these flood researches, these people researching, you know, some floodplains in different parts with, you know, it's like saying, oh, this layer is this and this layer is that. He came together to say that all of these papers are proving a global flood and not just small floods here, there, you know, wherever, because they're all showing the same data. They're all coming back to the same conclusion that there was massive floods, and it all points to Noah's flood, even though the science is trying to say, oh no, these were this time, these were that time. But if you look at the data, if you look at the different ways that they're trying to prove this theory, it doesn't actually prove the theory of evolution. It actually proves the theory of creation and the flood. Okay? And when I pointed it out, people were like, oh, that's just a bunch of scientific papers. And I'm like, yeah, and? What do they prove? Tell me, what does it prove? Have you read every single scientific paper on that website? I skimmed a few. I didn't read all of them. But I skimmed a few. Read their abstracts, kind of looked over some of their graphs. And yeah, the guy's totally right. The people are coming to the same conclusions. But because their mindset is the Earth is billions of years old, they're trying to construe the data. They're trying to come to the conclusion that the data says that it's this many millions of years old. When in actuality, if you really look into the data, it doesn't show that. It shows that all of these floods probably happened at the same time, and it was probably one gigantic flood. Okay? And there are a lot of people out there in the geologic community that are coming to the realization that there was, at one point, between 5 to 10,000 years ago, plus or minus about 1,000 years, okay, which puts it firmly in that 4,400 year category, okay, that there was a global flood at some point in the past, okay, that radically changed the Earth. Because when they start observing how flooding works, how flooding drastically changes landscapes, just in the matter of days and weeks, they start thinking, well, what would happen if there was like a flood that covered the entire Earth? What would that look like, and how would it drastically change the Earth? And you know who they're using for that? It's not Ken Hovind. It's Walt Brown. Okay? And his hydroplate theory. Because there's still water trapped under the earth. We know this. Okay? It's now miles below the earth because the crust has deformed so much. Okay? Because the reason why we have oceans as deep as we do is because if you look at where the seams, the mid-Pacific and the mid-Atlantic ridges are, those are typically the deepest parts of the ocean. And you know what? Those would have been the places that drained first. Those would have been the places where the water would have eroded away a lot of the dirt and everything and pushed it out to the sides. And so after that water pushed out of the crust, what would have happened to that crust? Would have collapsed in on itself. Which means you would have deeper water because that stuff would have displaced the water back out of it and on top of the dirt layer. Why, ergo why we have the Challenger Deep, ergo why we have all these different things. Okay? And the thing is that when you had that moving, okay, when you had all that plate action, because all of that stuff would have been moving out, all of the plates would have been drastically changing because of the fact that there was all this water being thrust upwards, okay, you would have had, in some places, okay, you would have had where the mantle would have pushed up, would have bubbled up to the surface, and then pushed crust out. We call those hot spots. Okay? And guess where one of those hot spots is? Oh, that's right, Hawaii. And if you look, okay, if you really take a look at it, go to Google Earth. Or not Google Earth, but Google Maps. Hit the little view button. Click satellite. Okay? And go out to Hawaii. Okay? Then from Hawaii, pinch it out. Okay? Or if you're on your browser, okay, click the little minus button and go out a little ways. Start following the chain back up. It does this. It goes up, and then it turns and goes this way. Okay? And that means that at some point, okay, the hot spot hasn't moved, okay, on the Earth. The hot spot is in the same spot. It's on the big island of Hawaii. It's actually, there's a new island forming just south of the big island of Hawaii. There's a big underwater mountain right there. Okay? Hasn't reached the surface yet, but it's coming. Thing is, you have that right there. You have the big island of Hawaii here. Okay, there's Kilauea, there's Mauna Loa, there's Mauna Kea. Okay, where they have the Keck Observatory. If you look back up the Hawaiian Islands, okay, it goes all the way up to about midway. Okay, then it takes a 90 degrees. So you're telling me that a plate that has been steadily moving westward or eastward, okay, turn 90 degrees all of a sudden? How did that happen? And if you look at Midway and you look at like a lot of the atolls that are part of that chain, some of them don't even reach the surface. And the ones that do are so flat that they barely have anything on them. Like you look at Midway, Midway's nothing. It is a coral atoll in the middle of nowhere, okay? But it's part of the Hawaiian Island chain, which means it was part of that hotspot at one point, okay? Which means that if you follow it back up to the source, where the chain kind of stops, okay? That means that chain used to be over the hotspot where Hawaii is today, where the big island of Hawaii is today, and that little tiny mountain is forming on the other side of it. Okay? Which means that at some point, that thing was down over there, like this, okay? And the plate was moving in this direction, and then all of a sudden it stopped and started moving this way. Because the way that the Hawaii is moving, it's moving steadily to the southeast. The hotspot is. Which means that the plate is moving to the northwest. And it used to be moving to the northeast. Well, actually, southeast. Because it was moving this way, and then it moved this way. Okay? Explain that one. If it's been moving steadily, a few inches a year, blah, blah, blah. Okay? It's moving that much now. But it seems to me that it was moving a hell of a lot faster. Because the thing is that they found that just about, 40 or 50 years ago, Mauna Loa was still active. And Kilauea was just becoming active. And now Mauna Loa doesn't erupt anymore. It hasn't for years. Nigh on 20 or 30 years now, it hasn't erupted. In fact, you can walk through the caldera. There's plants growing in it. It's crazy. Now, Kilauea has been erupting steadily for years, and it has been pumping out a lot of brand new material, okay? In fact, the big island of Hawaii has grown a ton since Kilauea became active, okay? Because it has been sending a whole hunk of land, new land, every single day, okay, into the sea. Now, most of it right now can't be used because it's still hot lava, okay? I've been there. You can kind of walk on it, but about a foot or two beneath your feet is molten lava, okay? You wouldn't build a house on it. Because if you ever had the plate move like it did, okay, it would likely crack and your house would fall into it. But it's new land. And they started monitoring this island. And at first, this new island that's growing just to the southeast of the big island of Hawaii. And they can't figure out why it's growing so much. Because originally they thought, oh, it's only growing a tiny amount per year, it's not a big deal. But it's growing at a rate where it's going to breach the surface, I think they said by 2040 to 2050, this island will breach the surface. It's much faster than they anticipated. They thought it was going to be back when I was a kid, and this island was just forming underneath, because that was where the hot spot is, the plate is moving over the hot spot like this, okay? And right now, the hot spot, which is about that big, is Kilauea and that new island down below it, okay? That's at the southeastern end. At the northwestern end is where Kilauea is, okay? That's where the hot spot is, okay? Underneath the big island of Hawaii. So if that thing is there, what they couldn't figure out was, when I was a kid, okay, that island was barely growing. So they thought it was going to take 100 to 200 years for that sucker to even be big enough to be just to poke its, little spire out of the thing. Since they've been monitoring it, okay, because I grew up in the 80s, since they started monitoring it, its growth has just expanded to the point where it's coming to the surface faster than they anticipated. And they were like, yeah, it's not going to be no 100 years, 150 years. It's going to breach probably in my lifetime. Like I said, between 2040 and 2050, I think. That's huge. Because it proves that the geology doesn't happen slowly over billions of years. It proves that geology is a very rapid process at times. And that's probably because when that mountain started building was when the hot spot was just coming out of Mauna Loa on the northwestern end. Kilauea was erupting, and this new chunk was just starting to grow, and it was very slow because the hot spot hadn't really gotten underneath it yet. Now that that hot spot is underneath it, it is bubbling like crazy because it's fresh magma blowing up into this big mountain range underneath. Okay? So, yeah. And it was kind of funny because, like, when Leilani Estates happened back in 2018, when they had that small earthquake on the island and Leilani Estates erupted, I had actually just been out there and driven by, I didn't go down there and see it, but I had driven by, so I knew pretty much where Leilani Estates was, because I'd gone to Kilauea and then went around Leilani Estates up to Hilo from Kona, okay? And when I heard about this thing, I was like, what in the world? And the geologists were like, we don't know why this thing is happening up there. And I'm like, duh, lava tube. There was probably a lava tube that ran right by where Kilauea Crater is, and when that thing happened, there was so much pressure against the rock wall that it shattered, and the magma went into that lava tube and went right down there to where Leilani Estates is, and then started erupting. And it likely, where the furthest eruptions, which were some of the first vents, was the end of the lava tube, and then it backed up, and then that's when it just started busting out everywhere, okay? This is all stuff you can look at, and you don't need no master's degree with, stuff in papers and all that kind of stuff. You don't need that to know what's going on. You just have to look at the earth and what is happening. There is nothing that is showing. The plates are moving, a few centimeters to an inch a year, okay? A couple inches a year. Now. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it wasn't always that way, okay? Because like I said towards the beginning of this, to make the Himalayas, the people realize now that to get the height that they have and not erode flat, is that it had to A, have been soft, and B, have been traveling very, very quickly when it hit. Okay? Same thing with the North American to the Pacific plate to create the Sierra Nevadas as high as they are. Okay? And the Rocky Mountains as high as they are. So, yeah. Because you look at that picture on the screen right now. Just look at it. There is not a broken rock in the place. There are separations between the rock, which happens naturally when the rock forms. Okay? That much is known. Okay? Because we can observe that. But what we don't know is, how did it get that bent? Okay? That is like what I observed down in Bishop, California on the tongue. Because it looked like the tongue that the Rolling Stones are like Gene Simmons' tongue. That's why they called it the tongue, because it looked like a tongue. Okay? And like, literally, you're going, there's no way that could have formed when that rock, because there's no way that it could have gotten squished like that if the rock was solid. Without some massive shattering happening in the middle of it, which there wasn't evidence of, okay? Because we literally observed it for like 3 days. Because we spent 3 days at that place, okay? So, that's the reason. smash that like button, hit subscribe, drop a comment below, let me know what you think of this series so far. We will finish this one on the next one. And so, you know, just keep on keeping on, folks, because this kind of stuff, I'm not saying, don't get me twisted here. I'm not saying that I'm better than Dan. I'm not saying that, you know, all this kind of stuff. I'm just pointing to the fact that all of these pop atheists out there, like SciManDan, like Dave Farina, like all these other people, yeah, they always like to point, you know, oh yeah, you have a master's degree, oh, do you have this, oh, do you have that? It doesn't matter, okay? Because some of the people with master's degrees may not understand everything either. The master's degree just means they spend a whole lot of money and a whole lot of time sitting in a classroom, sitting in a lab, doing some stuff, writing a paper, okay? And maybe they're a professor, maybe they're not, maybe they're actually studying that field, maybe they're not, who knows, okay? But just because you have a master's degree doesn't make you master of the universe, okay? And if I can poke holes in the theory, and I don't have a master's degree in geology, and I can point to stuff, maybe there's something to it. And as we say, we will see you on the next one.